There's a specific moment you might know all too well. It's that morning you wake up, stare at the ceiling before even reaching for your phone, and feel a kind of nameless weight. It's not exhaustion, because you slept. It's not sadness, because nothing terrible happened. It's something more diffuse, more profound, a sense that the day ahead is just another repeat of days past. And that somewhere between breakfast and quitting time, you'll silently ask yourself what it's all for. You have your responsibilities, your goals, your to-do lists. Maybe you're even disciplined, someone who gets up early, meets deadlines, doesn't let themselves fall behind. And yet there's that quiet, persistent voice asking if all the effort is worth it, if the destination will be as satisfying as the race promised, if focus and productivity are truly the missing ingredients for life to make sense. Because here's the paradox: nobody in the hustle culture ever reveals. It's perfectly possible to be highly focused and profoundly empty at the same time. It's possible to execute with surgical precision a life that deep down means nothing to you. This feeling isn't weakness. It's not a lack of discipline or ambition. It's what Viktor Frankl, one of the 20th century's most important thinkers, called existential emptiness, and he spent decades studying why seemingly successful, functional, and productive people could carry within them a silent abyss that no achievement could fill. What Frankl discovered, from one of the most devastating human experiences ever recorded in history, will completely reframe how you understand not just focus, but the very meaning of striving for anything. Because the problem isn't that you're unfocused. The problem might be that you're focused on the wrong things, or even better, that you're so busy focusing you've never stopped to ask what truly deserves that focus. Viktor Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905, and from a young age demonstrated an uncommon mind, corresponding in his teens with Sigmund Freud and questioning the foundations of psychoanalysis before even graduating. But it was from 1942, when he was deported to Nazi concentration camps including Auschwitz, that his theories moved beyond mere intellectual speculation and became a matter of literal survival. For nearly 3 years, Frankl lived in conditions that defy imagination: extreme hunger, forced labor, constant violence, the loss of all material possessions, the loss of family members, the loss of all privacy and formal dignity. The Nazis stripped him of his name and replaced it with a number. They took his clothes, his belongings, his documents, the work of a lifetime he carried with him, which was destroyed at the camp entrance. Everything that could be taken was taken. And it was precisely within this context of total stripping away that Frankl made the discovery that would change psychology forever. The observation that there was something no tormentor could confiscate, the freedom to choose one's own attitude in the face of what was happening. Not the freedom to change the circumstances, because those were atrocious and unmovable, but the inner freedom to decide what it all meant and how to respond to it as a human being. This realization might seem abstract until you grasp what it directly implies for your own life. If a man in Auschwitz could preserve his deepest human dimension through the choice of how he related to his suffering, then what does that say about our own crises, our own feelings of emptiness and lack of purpose? Frankl wasn't being naive or insensitive to suffering. He lived it firsthand. He was saying something far more radical: that human beings are not merely a product of their circumstances, that there is a dimension of existence that remains free even when everything else has been destroyed, and that it is in this dimension that life's meaning finds its most authentic dwelling. But what exactly is this meaning Frankl speaks of? And why is it so different from the focus that contemporary culture sells us as the solution to all our problems? Here we arrive at the heart of logotherapy, the therapeutic system developed by Frankl, whose name comes from the Greek logos, which can be translated as both word and meaning. The fundamental premise is seemingly simple, but has enormous consequences. The primary motivation of human beings is not pleasure, as Freud proposed, nor power, as Alfred Adler suggested, but the search for meaning. When this search is frustrated, when a person doesn't find sufficiently deep reasons for their own existence, what Frankl called the existential vacuum arises. A state that isn't exactly clinical depression, nor anxiety in the technical sense, but a form of spiritual suffering, an emptying of the noetic dimension of existence, which is the specifically human dimension, the one that distinguishes us from animals and machines. And here I want to make a genuine pause and speak directly to you. I know many of you who have found this video carry this very vacuum, sometimes without having words to name what you feel. You might have a productive routine, clear goals, use all the focus and time management techniques out there, and still wake up with that feeling that something is missing that no productivity system can deliver. So I really want to know, have you ever experienced that moment when you were in the middle of an achievement, something you worked hard to get, and instead of feeling the expected satisfaction, you felt an even greater emptiness, as if the arrival revealed the promise was false? If you know that moment, simply write in the comments, "I arrived and still felt empty." You don't need to explain anything else. This simple gesture isn't just about you. It's about creating a space down here where others who feel the same can see they're not alone. That this painful paradox is more common than the performance world lets on, and that there's a way out that doesn't involve more focus or more discipline, but something much more fundamental. By sharing, you might be giving words to what someone else has felt for years, but couldn't name. Frankl observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical practice in Vienna, even before the concentration camps. Patients who came to his office not with classic neuroses in the Freudian sense, generated by repressed childhood conflicts, but with a different kind of suffering that he termed logoneurosis. A neurosis born not from psychological conflicts, but from existential ones. From the inability to find sufficiently deep reasons to keep investing in one's own life. And the most disturbing aspect of these observations was that these patients were often outwardly successful people. They had careers, relationships, material achievements. They didn't lack focus, they lacked meaning. And this distinction, seemingly semantic, is in practice the difference between a life that can endure almost any suffering and a life that implodes even in the face of minor difficulties. Because a life with meaning has a reason to persevere, while a life merely focused on goals is constantly at the mercy of the quality of those goals. This understanding leads us to one of Frankl's most quoted and least understood sentences, taken from his most famous work, "Man's search for meaning. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Frankl didn't invent this idea. He found it in Nietzsche and lived it empirically in the concentration camps. But what he added to it is crucial. The why cannot be just anything. It cannot be a goal empty of real existential content. It cannot be a target created to impress others. It cannot be an ideal abstracted entirely from a person's lived reality. Meaning, to be genuinely sustaining, needs to be discovered, not invented. It needs to emerge from the intersection of who the person is and what life is asking of them at that specific moment. This is a distinction that separates Frankl's thinking from practically all contemporary motivational literature. Frankl never tells you to create your passion or invent your purpose as if they were products to be manufactured. He says that meaning already exists, waiting for you, and that your task is to develop enough sensitivity to perceive it. But how does one develop this sensitivity? And how does it concretely differ from the focus that all the coaches and productivity books promise as a solution? Focus, in the sense the word is used today, is a cognitive capacity. It's the ability to direct attention to a specific task and resist distractions. There's nothing wrong with this ability. It's necessary and useful. The problem begins when focus is treated as if it were an existential virtue in itself, as if the ability to concentrate attention, regardless of the object of that concentration, were sufficient to create a meaningful life. Frankl would have called this a confusion between means and ends, between instrument and destiny. Focus is a means, meaning is the end. And when we invert this hierarchy, when we start cultivating focus as if it were the purpose itself, we create people who are increasingly efficient at executing tasks that are increasingly devoid of real existential relevance. This is what Frankl observed becoming an epidemic in the modern Western world, especially in affluent societies where basic material needs are met, but an existential vacuum spreads silently. He wrote about it with a precision that seems tailor-made for describing today's world. The dominant neurosis of our time is no longer Freud's hysteria, but existential boredom, the feeling of absurdity and futility. In short, the existential vacuum. When you have focus without meaning, you have efficiency in service of the vacuum. You become better and better at reaching destinations that ultimately mean nothing to you, and each achievement, instead of filling the void, more clearly reveals the abyss beneath. If these ideas are resonating with you, if you recognize in this description something you've carried in silence for a long time without being able to name it, I want you to know that this channel exists precisely for that. Here, we explore Frankl's thought and that of other humanist philosophers weekly, those who took seriously the most fundamental question of existence. How can a life be truly meaningful, not just successful, not just productive, but genuinely imbued with a meaning that withstands suffering, doubt, and the very vacuum that modernity produces on an industrial scale? If you feel you've finally found a space where these questions are treated with the seriousness they deserve, subscribe to this channel. You don't have to walk this journey alone. Come be part of a community of people brave enough to question what they've been sold as answers and seek something more true. Frankl identified 3 main paths through which human beings can find genuine meaning, and each of them contrasts profoundly with the promise of focus as an existential solution. The first path is what he called values of creation, which are realized when a person contributes something to the world. When they create, produce, build something that didn't exist before their effort. This might seem close to the contemporary idea of focusing on goals, but the difference is fundamental. In Frankl, the value of creation isn't about the achievement itself. It's about the act of transcending oneself towards something greater. The person who paints a picture to express something they feel is true is doing something radically different from the person who paints pictures to accumulate followers. The first is giving themselves to the creative act. The second is using the creative act as an instrument for an egocentric goal. And Frankl was very clear about this. Genuine meaning always involves self-transcendence, always points beyond one's own ego towards something or someone that surpasses them. The second path is through experiential values, realized when a person genuinely opens themselves to what life offers, especially in encounters with other human beings. Frankl described the experience of love as one of the most powerful ways to find meaning, not the romanticized love of popular songs, but love as the capacity to see another in their deepest uniqueness, to recognize in them a richness that exists independently of any utility they might have for you. In the concentration camps, Frankl sustained himself in part through the mental presence of his wife, through the love he felt for her even without knowing if she was alive. In that context of horror, love wasn't a luxury feeling. It was one of the few things that made existence bearable and imbued with dignity. This has powerful implications for how we think about relationships today, in a culture that often treats them as just another item to be optimized on the agenda of a productive life. The third path is what Frankl considered the deepest and noblest, attitudinal values, realized when a person chooses how to relate to suffering that cannot be avoided. This is where Frankl's thought most radically diverges from any self-help philosophy or performance culture. While focus always implies the possibility of control, of transforming circumstances through the power of concentration and will, Frankl recognized that there are sufferings that cannot be resolved, circumstances that cannot be optimized, terminal illness, irreparable loss, insurmountable physical limitations. And it was in these contexts that he made his most profound observation, that even there, especially there, human beings can find meaning. Not in spite of suffering, but through the stance one chooses to adopt in its face. A man who knows why he suffers can bear almost anyhow, and a person who finds dignity in suffering itself transforms that experience into something that transcends pain and touches what Frankl called the spiritual dimension of existence. Here it's important to distinguish what Frankl meant by spiritual, because he used the word rigorously and non-religiously, though it was compatible with religious spirituality. For Frankl, the spiritual or noetic dimension of a human being is simply that dimension that transcends biological and psychological processes that cannot be reduced to impulses, conditioning, or pleasure and pain dynamics. It is the dimension of freedom, responsibility, and meaning. It is where the capacity for self-distancing resides, the ability to separate oneself from oneself enough to observe one's own instincts, impulses, and emotions without being entirely determined by them. And it is where self-transcendence resides, the capacity to move towards something or someone beyond one's own ego. Frankl used a powerful image to illustrate the difference between the human search for meaning and the pursuit of pleasure or power. The seeing eye. A healthy eye does not see itself. When you are looking at a beautiful landscape, you are not looking at your own eyeball. The eye functions precisely because it forgets itself in favor of what it is contemplating. And human existence functions in the same way. When a person is truly absorbed in something that gives them meaning, they forget themselves, they transcend themselves. And it is paradoxically in this self-forgetting that they become most fully themselves. This Frankl called self-transcendence, and it is the opposite of the stance that contemporary culture promotes when it encourages people to focus on themselves, on their personal growth, on their performance, on their personal brand. The more a person tries to focus on their own happiness, the more happiness flees. The more they dedicate themselves to something larger than themselves, the more they find genuine satisfaction as an unlooked-for byproduct of that commitment. This is the basis of one of logotherapy's most original techniques, dereflection. Frankl developed it to deal with patients suffering from the exact opposite problem of a lack of focus. An excess of attention turned inward. Insomniacs who the more they tried to sleep, the more awake they became. Patients with sexual dysfunctions who the more they monitored their own performance, the worse they got. Anxious patients who the more they observed their own anxiety, the more it grew. In all these cases, the problem wasn't a lack of focus, it was an excess of self-reflection, and the solution was to redirect attention outward, to another person, to a meaningful task, to anything that would pull the person out of the prison of constant self-monitoring. And Frankl observed that when this happened, when the person forgot themselves in favor of something genuinely significant, the symptoms often disappeared on their own, not because they had been directly attacked, but because they had been deprived of the soil that fed them. What this implies for everyday life is a complete subversion of contemporary productivity logic. The focus and performance industry tells us you need to optimize your attention, eliminate distractions, build ever more efficient routines to achieve your goals, and there's nothing wrong with attention, routines, and efficiency as instruments. Frankl would say, but where is that efficient attention pointing? If it's pointing to goals the person adopted because they were culturally valued, economically rewarding, or aesthetically satisfying, but which have no deep connection to the person's own uniqueness and what life is asking of them at this moment, then all that efficiency is the efficiency of a flashlight pointing in the wrong direction. You'll see the path that leads nowhere very clearly. Frankl had a clear position on the nature of meaning that deserves to be understood in all its radicality. He believed that each human being has a unique and singular meaning that can only be discovered by that specific person, in the specific circumstances of their life, at that specific moment of their existence. Meaning is not universal. It cannot be prescribed by a guru. It cannot be copied from a successful person. It cannot be extracted from a self-help book, however sophisticated. This doesn't mean there are no universal values or that there is no wisdom in humanity's philosophical and spiritual traditions. It means that these traditions and values function as a general map, but you still have to discover for yourself where you are on the map and which path is yours. And this discovery requires something that focus alone cannot provide. It requires the courage to honestly confront who you are, what your life is asking of you, and what is the unique response that only you can give to that calling. Viktor Frankl described human conscience in the sense of moral and existential awareness as a sense organ. Just as the eye is the organ that perceives colors and shapes, conscience is the organ that perceives what is right and what has meaning in a given situation. But like any organ, it needs to be developed, exercised, and can atrophy if not used. One of the tragedies of contemporary culture, in Frankl's analysis, is that hyperconnection. The constant noise of information, the pressure for quick answers, and the pursuit of external validation atrophy this very organ. People become increasingly efficient at responding to external demands and less capable of hearing the inner voice that points to what truly matters. Focus without silence doesn't build the capacity to perceive meaning. It just creates more well-organized noise. This is one of the reasons why Frankl advocated for practices that the productivity culture often dismisses as inefficient: contemplation, creative solitude, honest confrontation with existential questions that have no easy answers. Not as forms of paralysis or escapism, but as necessary conditions for a person to hear what their own existence is asking of them. In his own writings, Frankl often referred to the space between stimulus and response as the place where human freedom resides and where meaning can be perceived. In a world that compresses this space to a minimum, that turns every moment of silence into an opportunity for consumption or production, existential freedom contracts proportionally, and along with it, the capacity to find genuine reasons to live, love, and create. It's fascinating to note how Frankl differs here, not only from productivity systems, but also from other philosophical and psychological traditions. Freud would have said that what moves human beings are eros and thanatos, the life and death drives, and that psychology's task is to make these drives conscious and manageable. Jung would have spoken of individuation, the process of integrating the shadow aspects of the personality into a more complete whole. European existentialism, as articulated by Sartre, would have said that existence precedes essence, that human beings are condemned to be free to create themselves from nothing. Frankl dialogued with all these systems, but disagreed with fundamental aspects of each. He disagreed with Freud that pleasure was the primary motivation. He disagreed with Adler that power was. He agreed with Sartre about freedom, but disagreed about the creation of meaning. For Frankl, meaning is not created by human will. It is discovered by human consciousness as something that was already there, waiting to be perceived. This distinction isn't just theoretical. It has enormous practical consequences. If you believe meaning is created, then you are perpetually responsible for inventing sufficiently compelling reasons to continue. And when creativity runs dry, when the will has no more material to work with, you face existential collapse. But if you believe, as Frankl did, that meaning is discovered, then your task isn't to invent, but to develop enough sensitivity to perceive. It's a stance that fosters genuine humility, because it recognizes that life's meaning doesn't emanate from you but through you, that you are a channel, not a source, that life has something to ask of you that goes beyond what your will could have imagined on its own. In the concentration camps, Frankl observed that the capacity to survive and preserve one's humanity was correlated not with who was physically strongest, nor with who had the best survival techniques, but with who could maintain some reason to go on. He described prisoners who suddenly gave up, who lay down one morning and simply had no more strength to get up, even without any new physical deterioration. And he described others who survived objectively impossible conditions, sustained by an inner image, a love, an unfinished task, a child waiting on the other side of the war. The difference wasn't about focus, it was about meaning. Focus is a tool that functions in service of a direction. Meaning is the direction itself, and without direction, focus is just energy spinning in circles. Frankl also developed a therapeutic technique called paradoxical intention, which beautifully illustrates how meaning operates differently from conventional focus. The technique involves asking the patient to intend exactly what they fear. A patient afraid of sweating in social situations would be instructed to try to sweat as much as possible. A patient afraid of stuttering would be instructed to try to stutter intentionally in their next conversation. What Frankl observed was that when the person stopped fighting the symptom and started trying to produce it intentionally, something strange happened. The symptom often disappeared or diminished dramatically. This is because the symptom fed on anxiety, and anxiety fed on the conflict between what the person wanted and what they feared would happen. By removing the conflict through paradoxical intention, the ground for the symptom was drained. This isn't just a clever technique. It's an illustration of how human existence functions on a deep level. Often, what we want to control is precisely what eludes control, and what we want to avoid strengthens as we try to avoid it. Meaning doesn't work that way. It doesn't flee when you approach, it deepens. Think of someone you know who seems to have truly found their place in the world. Not necessarily the most successful or recognized person, but that person who, when they talk about what they do, seems complete, as if the activity and the person were made for each other. This person likely didn't spend their life applying increasingly sophisticated focus techniques. They probably found, through trial and error and a lot of honesty with themselves, something that needed them in a specific way, something that used their most unique qualities to respond to a need that existed outside of them. And when this connection happens, focus comes along, not as a technique, but as a natural consequence of being committed to something that has real existential weight. Frankl called this finding one's unique mission, and he believed that every human being has one, and that part of life's journey is discovering it through honest engagement with one's own abilities, values, and circumstances. The question you might be asking right now is, how do I do this? How do I find meaning instead of just chasing goals that might be empty on a deeper level? And here, Frankl gives us concrete guidance that radically differs from productivity systems. First, he suggests we pay attention not to what we want from life, but to what life is asking of us. This inversion is key. Instead of starting with your wish list and working backward toward reality, start with the concrete reality of your situation and ask what it requires of you. What are the talents you possess that someone or something genuinely needs? What are the responsibilities your life has placed before you that only you can answer? What are the sufferings you carry that, if processed with courage and honesty, could illuminate something for others walking through the same darkness? Second, Frankl suggests we take seriously moments of deep resonance, those times when you're doing something, and time seems to stop, when you feel you're exactly where you should be, when the effort feels not like a cost, but an expression. These moments are not escapism or coincidence. They are signals from your existential consciousness, pointing to an alignment between who you are and what you are doing. Productivity culture often tells us to ignore these signals if they don't align with the most profitable or recognized path. Frankl would say ignoring these signals is the fastest route to existential emptiness. Third, and perhaps most difficult, Frankl invites us to find meaning in suffering that cannot be avoided. This doesn't mean passively accepting injustice or giving up on changing what can be changed. It means that when you face truly insurmountable circumstances, loss, illness, genuine limitations, there is still one last freedom available: the choice of how you relate to that suffering. If you can transform your pain into a testament to human dignity, if you can use what you've learned in suffering to help others facing the same, if you can find within limitation a form of expression that abundance would never have generated, then you will have discovered what Frankl called the meaning of suffering. And that meaning doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it a different weight, a weight that sustains instead of crushes. Let's return now to where we started. That morning when you wake up and feel the nameless weight, that sense that focus and discipline aren't getting to the root of the problem. Now you have a language for what you're feeling, and more than language, a direction. The problem wasn't that you needed more focus, it was that the focus was in service of goals that weren't rooted deeply enough in the soil of what truly matters to you as a singular, unrepeatable being. Frankl survived Auschwitz not because he had superior focus or time management techniques. He survived because he managed to preserve, even within the most absolute horror, the perception that there was something only he could do, something life was specifically asking of him, and that this task was worth the cost of continuing to exist. And when he emerged from the camps, he spent the rest of his long life. He died at 92, communicating this discovery to successive generations with an urgency that time didn't diminish. The future doesn't belong to the most focused. It belongs to those who have found reasons deep enough for focus to be a natural consequence of genuine commitment to something larger than themselves. It belongs to those who have had the courage to ask not just how to do things more efficiently, but why those things are worth doing and for whom and with what right. It belongs to those who have discovered that meaningless productivity is well-organized slavery, and who have chosen the imperfect, sometimes painful freedom of an existence oriented by something that truly matters. Frankl saw this with a clarity that only extreme horror can forge. We have the privilege of learning this lesson in a less devastating way, if we have the honesty to hear it. If this video resonated with you, if you feel what was said here deserves to be heard by more people carrying that quiet emptiness, please give it a like now and share it with someone you think needs to hear this. And if you want to continue this conversation, if you want to dive deeper into Frankl's thought and discover concrete tools to turn the search for meaning into a living practice, not just a pretty idea, subscribe to this channel. Here we take the questions that matter most seriously. Here you'll find, week after week, serious philosophical companionship for the journey of a life worth living. See you in the next video.